Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's virtual class, Deer Aging and Scoring. I'm Chris Hearn. I'm the West Tennessee Field Rep over here in Jackson, Tennessee. I've guided at some different places that aging deer on the hoof was very important. Scoring deer, all that played a factor, and it's a very important management tool if you're a deer hunter, and especially if you're hunting on private lands, or if you're just wanting to, kind of help manage for bigger antlers. It all plays a factor on as far as herd health and things like that. So looking forward to sharing with you guys what I've learned throughout the years. So all that being said, let's dive right in. A little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight is why do you want to age and score your deer? What's the benefits? Aging deer on the hoof, and then also kind of confirming what you've seen by aging deer after the harvest and some of the different techniques. Scoring deer, obviously after the harvest, and scoring deer on the hoof. So we'll take plenty of questions as we go through this. So if I come across something that you guys don't understand, stop me, and you can use this Q&A function to ask questions. I'll answer most of the questions live. I could reply through text, but also you have a chat function there, and that's where you can put things for the good of the group. So why is knowing age and score important? There's three factors that contribute to antler growth in whitetail deer, and that's going to be age, genetics, and nutrition. Now, there is a few things we can do as far as genetics, but overall changing the herd genetic composition of a herd is very difficult. Nutrition, unless you're somewhere where you can do supplement feeding or you're planting some kind of high protein food source, for the most part, that's out of our control. But one thing we can do is we can make sure that these deer are getting to the proper age to live up to their utmost antler potential. So understanding the age of the deer herd could help to find the limiting factor on antler growth. When I guided at Giles Island, it was an 11,000 acre island in Mississippi, and we had a rule: 8 points or less, they had to be 4 years or older. 9 points or more, they had to be 5 years or older. And what we were doing is we were somewhat controlling those genetics, but we were letting deer get to 4 years old, taking a look at them, and then deciding if we wanted to harvest them at that time. But ideally, through a management practice like that over enough time, you can start to kind of get your genetics a little bit better, because you are taking more of those 8 points and less deer and trying to get them out of the herd. There's some other ways that even public lands here in Tennessee have tried to kind of help with genetics, and the most easy way on public land is something like a 4 on one side rule or 15-inch minimum spread. We can talk about some of this stuff as we get into scoring deer on the hoof and some of the things you can look for. But that's a lot of the reason of why a person would want to know the age and the score of deer. So in building this PowerPoint, there was a lot of resources out there. These are three of the main ones, and I've used some of their slides. So if you guys want more information after tonight's class, feel free to visit these different websites, and you can get a ton of information from them as well. So to start off, just talking about the life cycle of a whitetail buck, you can kind of see the way a deer starts out at basically a yearling, so it's not on here. So most of your fawns are born in June, July, when there's it's the perfect time of year for a doe to be raising a fawn. There's plenty of cover, there's plenty of food, and kind of gets them up and ready 6 months old before you get into the dead of winter. And then at 1.5, you can see they start to put on antlers. They're really small necked, they're small body. You can kind of see the way their chest is sucked up tight, and just overall they're going to have small antlers, they're going to have small body size. And then at 2.5 years old, you can see they're starting to get a little bulkier. They're only living up to about 30% of their potential, but a really good genetic 2.5-year-old deer, even in Tennessee, could be up 115, 120 as far as a score. So never really, you can't go by antler size when you're talking about aging deer on the hoof. But in general, younger bucks have smaller antlers. They're still, their belly's not sagging. They're just all kind of like a teenager, you could say. They're built and they're stocky and they carry themselves that way. At 3.5 years old, I'm going to say a lot of people that's trying to manage at 4.5, 3.5-year-old bucks is really where, especially in the rut, they can be deceiving. They can look a little older than they really are. I'll go on through these. So 2.5-year-old, we're at 3.5. And at 3.5, these bucks are starting to show most of their antler potential. They're up 60, 70, 80%. This chart says 70, 80%. Their head is another really good judge in trail camera pictures, especially in the summer when their body is still just, they're not rutted up. Their necks are small because it's summertime. A lot of time their head will give away their age. They seem to have a little shorter snout, so to speak. And again, basically at 3.5, you're not seeing a sagging belly, but it's not as all up in the chest like a teenager, more or less. And then as we get into 4.5, you start to see, blockier chest. They're 80 to 90% of their antler potential. A lot of the way they carry themselves, they're normally going to be a more dominant deer. So when you see them around does or you see them around other smaller bucks, they're starting to show that dominance. And another thing, I've never really paid a lot of attention to the glands because it just takes them being so close and things. But throughout as bucks get older, their glands are getting a little more stained back there on the back legs. But the main thing you're going to start looking for is you're going to look for that sagging stomach, swayed back. Generally, by the time a deer gets to around 6.5 years old, he's going to be carrying some battle scars around his face, and he's just going to show it. I will say when you get an eye for mature animals, it really translates over from species to species. And I don't care if you're bear hunting out west and you're trying to pick out a mature 7-8-year-old black bear, or if you're trying to pick out a 4 or 5-year-old white-tailed deer, the mannerisms, the way their bodies and their necks and their heads kind of change through the years. It really does pertain to most all species, just as it does in humans, really. One thing I really, really look for, I run a lot of trail cameras, and me keeping track of deer year after year, I just really have an eye for anything that's going to make a deer stand out. So, this one is a very obvious one. He's got a very deep cut right ear. I've been able to keep up with deer through the years, but that's got a big, like I hunted one deer had the mark of Zorro in his skin, and you couldn't see it in the winter, but in the summer with his summer coat, it was an obvious Z on his side. I've seen them with bad knees, bad ankles, scuff marks on their back from going under a fence, or potentially a burn where they got hit by a car. There's all kinds of little things that can make you distinguish that deer besides its antlers year after year. Yes, deer do put on very similar antlers from one year to the next, but there could be an injury, there could be something that changes those antler formations. So it's really important to look for those different little marks that's actually on the deer. And if you look for those, you're going to be able to tell that deer apart from others 12 months out of the year, and possibly track him through the years to know some real ages. So I believe up next we have a little video about deer aging that I found, and I found it to be very useful. So let's take a look at this if it'll play.
How old was your deer? This is a popular question around deer season. Often at processors and deer camps alike, you'll hear phrases like, "Look at that rack, that buck must be at least 4 or 5 years old." Or possibly, "That's an old deer, look how gray she is in the muzzle." But gray hair and antler size do not accurately reflect the age of any deer. To age a white-tailed deer with certainty, the best method is to pull a lower incisor, root attached, and send it to a laboratory for cross-sectioning. Many mammals, including deer, can be aged by staining these teeth and counting the rings that appear, just like on a tree. This process of determining a deer's age takes time and money. But this is not the only way to age a deer. There's another technique based on tooth wear and replacement patterns. Most questions regarding the age of a deer come during hunting season, so these instructions apply to aging deer killed during the Pennsylvania hunting seasons. Since most of these deer are born from mid-May to mid-June, their ages will be 6 months, 18 months, 30 months, 42 months, etc. A deer 6 months old is called a fawn. An 18-month-old deer is called a yearling, and older deer are called adults. Before we actually age a deer, let's define some of the terms we'll be using. Enamel is the white part of the tooth that covers all parts of newly emerged teeth. Dentine is the brown part of the tooth under the enamel. As the enamel wears away, dentine becomes visible. Dentine is not to be confused with the brown staining that builds up on the surface of the enamel. The amount of dentine showing is critical to aging a deer. A cusp is a point on the grinding surface of the tooth. Deer molars have either 2 or 3 cusps. Lingual crest is the top of the cusp on the tongue side of the tooth. 2 other commonly used terms are premolar and molar. Premolars are baby teeth, for lack of a better term, that are lost and replaced by permanent teeth. Molars are located in the back of the jaw, and unlike premolars, emerge only once and are not replaced. Yearling and adult deer have 3 premolars and 3 molars. Like children, deer replace their teeth in a systematic fashion. Once all teeth have been replaced with adult teeth, wearing away of the enamel and the amount of visible dentine on those teeth can be used to determine age. After 2.5 years of age, the point after which the age must be determined by these wear patterns alone, variability creeps in as individual deer have individual chewing patterns and diets. For example, a deer that spends most of its time eating corn and soybeans may show less wear than a deer that eats primarily woody browse growing in the forest. The first step in deer aging is to count the number of teeth on one half of the lower jaw, not including the front teeth. Up until about 10 months of age, a deer will have up to 5 teeth on each side of its lower jaw. The first 3 are premolars, followed by up to 2 molars. Jaws that have 5 or fewer teeth are considered fawns, approximately 6 months of age, born in May or June of the same year. If there are 6 teeth on the lower jaw, 3 premolars and 3 molars, the deer is at least 1.5 years of age. But just because a deer has 6 teeth does not mean they're done replacing them. As yearlings, deer will replace all 3 of their premolars. A yearling is approximately 18 months old, born in May or June of the previous year. The second step in deer aging is to determine whether a deer is 1.5 years of age or older. 1.5-year-old deer can have any one of 3 types of tooth configurations. First, look at the third premolar and count the number of cusps on the tooth. If it has 3 cusps, we know that the deer is 1.5 years old. Occasionally, you may see a 2-cusped adult tooth coming in right underneath the 3-cusped juvenile tooth before it's pushed out. If you count 6 teeth and notice any of the first 3 teeth, the premolars, in the process of being replaced, the deer is 1.5 years of age. If the third premolar is a 2-cusp tooth, the deer could be 1.5 years of age or maybe older. Distinguishing between a 1.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old can be difficult. To tell the difference, a closer inspection of the third premolar and the third molar, that would be the third and the 6th tooth on the jaw, is needed. There are 3 subtle differences between the wear patterns on a 1.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. First, look at the back half of the third premolar. There should not be any dentine showing through the enamel of a 1.5-year-old deer. Next, look at the last 2 inside or lingual crests of the last molar tooth. For a 1.5-year-old deer, these 2 crests should not show any dentine either. You will notice that the crests of the first and second molar, fourth and fifth teeth, show dentine. Remember, the deer has had these teeth longer than the third molar and therefore has been chewing on it longer. Lastly, look at the top of the third cusp of the last molar. A 1.5-year-old deer will not show any dentine on this cusp. Nowhere on the third and sixth teeth typically identifies a 1.5-year-old deer. The typical 2.5-year-old and older deer will show dentine on the third and sixth tooth, where it's lacking in the 1.5-year-old. Dentine in these key locations may be very slight. Seeing these sometimes subtle differences is part of the skill of aging deer. After 2.5 years of age, determining the age of a deer relies on tooth wear. As a deer ages, tooth enamel wears down, and the width of the dentine showing, or the amount of brown on the lingual crest, increases. Here's an example of an old deer showing significant wear and exposed dentine. As noted before, there are many factors that influence the individual tooth wear patterns of deer: diet, soil types, injury, individual chewing patterns, etc. Once all teeth are replaced, it's difficult to determine the age of a deer with certainty based on wear patterns alone. This is why the Game Commission ages deer into only 3 categories when collecting harvest data every fall. Trained Game Commission deer agers can reliably and consistently age deer to 6 months old, that's fawns, 18 months old, yearlings, and 30+ months, deer that are 2.5 years or older. Now here's an aging review. Using only the teeth in the back of the mouth, number 1, count the teeth. 5 teeth or less, 6-month-old deer. 6 teeth, 1.5-year-old or older deer. Next, count the number of cusps on the third tooth. 3 cusps, 1.5 years old or a yearling. 2 cusps, inspect the back half of the third tooth and inside high crests of the sixth tooth and the top of the last cusp on the sixth tooth. No dentine present on the lingual crest, 1.5-year-old or yearling. Visible dentine on the lingual crest, at least 2.5 years old. We hope you've enjoyed learning about deer aging, and will find it helpful the next time somebody asks you, how old is that deer?
So I hope you guys enjoyed that video, and I could have sat here and went through slides and looked at different teeth, but they done a really good job of breaking down tooth wear and dentine and enamel aging. And I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see this. I'll try to hold it up kind of by my face. But so I started this really about 10 years ago. Pretty much every deer that I've been a part of on any of my private farms that I hunt, I take the left jaw segment of the teeth and I just keep it. I write the date, I write something to help me remember that by. Lots of these deer I had trail camera pictures of, and I had a pretty good idea of the age of them, based on, when I started getting pictures of them, when they were harvested. I know the way they carried themselves, their body type. So all that being said, when you start collecting those teeth from deer year after year after year that's been on the same farms, feeding on basically the same things. Yes, some deer have a little bit of a different chewing pattern, just the habit in which where they chew acorns and different grains on different teeth, just like all humans kind of chew different as well. But I really have found that to be the best judge for age, just because year after year, every deer helps me get a little more precise by comparing them to other deer. So that's one tip. It don't take very long, especially if you're doing a European mount, or even if you're sending your deer off to have it done at a taxidermist. Just tell them, say, hey, would you mind to keep my bottom jaws or keep my left jaw? And then even if they haven't cleaned it up for you, it's very easy to boil that jaw in water, get it cleaned up, and put some salt on it, and it'll keep forever. You can drill a hole in them and put them on one big rope, so it's pretty easy for you to keep track of them. So another way, the best way to know exactly how old a deer is post-harvest is going to be looking at basically growth rings, just like a tree. Deer, particularly in Midwest, I'm going to say Tennessee is right on the line, because we have a harsh enough winter that they do leave a little bit of a growth ring in that tooth. if you get too far south, there's just not enough winter to really make a defined line. But if you're in a northern state, Tennessee and up, I would say, excuse me, you're going to be able to do a cross cut of that tooth, and you're going to be able to see the cementum and the annuli rings in that tooth. Now, there's a few different places that does that. I think I hadn't researched it in several years. I actually wanted to try to get the stuff to start doing some myself, but it's a very niche thing where there's just not a lot of people that know exactly how to do it. But there is some labs that you can research, and you can send a tooth to them, and they can tell you exactly how old your deer is. You know, I can't think of many instances when you would really, really need to know that information, but it is an option. I wanted you guys to know that. So any questions around deer aging? All right, if there's not any questions about aging, let's move into scoring. So the first thing, I just want to talk about a little bit of your measurements that you have whenever we're talking about scoring. We do have one question. Do you get in trouble if you shoot the wrong age deer? As far as any kind of state regulations, no, absolutely not. But there is some club rules that are going to have some kind of a, age requirement. If you did get into a private land club and they set some kind of rule of 3 years or older or 4 years or older, which is not uncommon, just because that club is trying to grow the best antler potential as possible, then it would be a club thing. There's no statewide regulations around age. Question. All right, so a little bit about the measurements, and we're going to go through each one of these in detail, but basically what you're looking at is H measurements or mass measurements, G measurements or tine length measurements. You have an inside spread, which is measured from the inside of the main beam, and then you actually have a main beam spread, main beam measurement. And this is basically a scoring sheet. So I will say there was several different apps that help you in the adding process, but I noticed that the one that I was using, I used Antler Insanity app for a long time, and then they started charging. And when you're adding all these numbers up, sometimes it's pretty difficult to do it in a calculator. So it really helps to have some kind of a cheat score sheet, like a interactive sheet. And I did find one on the Pope and Young page. So if you actually go to the Pope and Young website and look for a score sheet, it gives you an interactive score sheet option. Looks identical to this, but what it will do is you enter your measurements. It keeps a running tally of your score. And for me, basically what I'm looking for is a gross score. That's just the total amount of inches that the deer has produced. Now, as far as score books go, especially on both typical and non-typical, there's what's called deductions. And what that is the difference between the right antler and the left antler. To me, I'll probably get a lot of criticism from it, but I always say nets are for fishing. So net score, to me, means very little. I think if a deer put that energy into his antler, then he deserves credit for it, whether it's all on one side or the other or whatever. So that's just my opinion. Something you'll notice here is all measurements are to the nearest eighth. And one example is, like, if I've got somebody writing on a score sheet for me, I tell them right off the bat, I might call off 4/8 or 6/8. Well, yeah, we know that's a half inch and we know that's a 3/4 inch, but I always say it to the eighth. One, it's going to help your math at the end of the scoring, and two, it's showing that we did measure to the nearest eighth. It shows the significance. So if you remember that in math class, we want to make sure that we're showing that we did measure to the eighth. So that's why I always say, 2/8, 4/8, 6/8, even though it would be a quarter, half, or 3/4. So here's some of your measurements. So One of the things every deer is going to have is going to be a main beam measurement. And you can see the way that this tape is laid out on the outside of the main beam. Basically, each antler has a little bit of growth lines across the antler. We're going to come off the back of the pedestal, kind of the longest point of the main beam, and we're going to follow that. So if you go to an official scorer, they're going to use a cable that's very small diameter, and then they'll measure the cable on a tape measure. This is, I think, like a scoring tape that, it's kind of adhesive. That's not really all that necessary for sure. I use 99% of the time, I'm just using a seamstress tape, just a sewing tape that's soft, that can be flexible and lay out to the antler like you need it. So that's how you're going to measure a main beam, again, to the nearest eighth. Each tine is going to be measured. Basically, if you so a lot of times if you're watching me score, I'll take my tape, I'll lay just like the main beam would be, and I'm going to mark where that tine starts. So in other words, imagine that main beam, if the tine was not there, that's where your G measurements, your time measurements are going to start. And it's not uncommon for me to do that, take a pencil, something that I can erase and something that's not going to mark up my antlers, but I can basically go ahead and mark my starting spot for my tape and then come up and measure it. So your brow tines is your G1s, your next tine G2, your next tine G3, and then if he's a 10 point, he's going to have a G4, and then so on and so forth. The next measurement you're going to have is going to be the inside spread. This is measured from the inside of the main beams at the widest point. And then your next measurement is going to be your mass measurement. So every deer gets 4 mass measurements. So even if he's just an 8 point, he's still going to get an 8-4 measurement. You'll have one measurement between the pedestal and the G1, that's H1. Between G1, G2 is H2. Between G2 and G3 is H3. And then if you don't have an G4, what we're going to do is measure between the G3 and the main beam and go halfway and take a measurement there. And that would be H4 on an 8 point. If it's a 10 point, then it's going to be measured between G3 and G4. And even if it's more than a 10 point, 12 point, whatever, you still only get those 4 mass measurements each main beam. In the inside spread, what is the point you start at? So it will be the inside of the main beam and it'll be the widest point. So what I do is I put my tape on the insides of the main beam and I just kind of work it. Now you can't go from corner to corner, but just keep it about, running straight across your antlers and just move it back and forth until you find the widest point. Any other questions? Let's see, Mark asked, what's the record in Tennessee and what year? There is a Tennessee registry. Not many people use it that much anymore. But you would have to look in, I'm sure you could go to Boone and Crockett entries and look it up by state and see what it would be. But I would guess, that Stevens buck was actually the world record deer at one time. And I think he was like 240 something, come out of, I believe, Sumner County. That was at that middle-aged, upper 20s, lower 30 aged guy shot with a muzzleloader back. I guess that was about 4 years ago. So I would assume that would be our state record because at one time it was the world record. Yeah, Stephen Tucker, that's right, Sumner County. Yeah, I didn't know he was that big. 312 and 3/8. Wow. Yeah, I knew we held the world record for a short amount of time there. Some good questions. So let's talk about scoring deer in the field. Now, you know, there's a lot of different ways, and I'm probably going to cover this later on, but my mind on scoring deer in the field don't work like a lot of others. I've seen so many deer that I wound up knowing the score later that in my mind, when I see a deer, I think of a deer that was similar to it and what the difference between it and the deer that I know. So, you know, if this deer here, you know, I think, well, I remember that a deer that I carried a kid to shoot, and he killed him, and he wound up being 118 inches, and this deer is very similar with a little bit longer brow. You know, I figure this deer's 120. You know, that's kind of how my mind works. But until you build enough, you know, kind of knowledge around that, then you're going to have something to judge off of, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, in general, from tip to tip of a mature deer's ears is going to be about 15 inches. So when we're thinking about, you know, inside spread, that's a pretty good judge. So if we're 3 inches each side of the ears, outside of the ears, then we know that we're looking at about a 20-inch wide inside spread. So that's one way to tell. Now, obviously, if you're looking at deer running across a field and he turns and looks at you for a split second, well, that's not much time to do all this stuff. And that's why I kind of relate back to that, what I know, and compare it to. But this method is a very good way if you've got a lot of time to study something like a trail camera picture. But we'll run through all your different measurements and how to judge them. So the length of the average mature whitetail is going to be 7 to 8 inches. And this is, again, a way to start thinking about time length. So, you know, if I got a 7 or 8 inch ear and I'm looking at a deer from the side, I can compare my tines to that ear length. Also, another one is going to be your nose to eye, which is, again, about 7 to 8 inches. So just like we're trying to figure out our tine length, we're also looking at main beam length. So, you know, you're basically looking at 2.5, 3 ear lengths of main beam when you're talking about 20-inch main beams. A really good way for me to judge main beam length is when they're turning to the side, is that main beam coming way out, like over his nose? In general, if I've got a 4.5, 5.5-year-old deer looking at me, he's got average width, so I'm going to say 18 inches inside, and he turns sideways, and his main beams come out and they go out past his nostrils, you're normally going to be looking at a 23, 24-inch main beam. So that's a really good long main beam. You know, but all different deer have different antler configurations. Some come way out and they hook back, and that's another thing to kind of look for is, does the main beam come out and stop, or do they kind of turn back in towards each other? So all of them play a factor on main beam length, but in my mind, the main beam, establishing how long your main beam is probably the most important part for figuring out the rest of the score, because it does make up a lot of your score, and that's also, to me, what a lot of everything else is measured off of. You know, mass, there's some different characteristics here, like basically the width of an eye would make up 4 inches of circumference. Obviously, the eye is not 4 inches wide, but, you know, let's say it's 1.5 inches and you have a circumference that is 1.5 inches wide, it's going to wind up being about 4 inches. 4 inches at the base is not a very massive deer. When we start talking about 5.25 to 6 inch bases, that's, you know, you're really getting into some really good mass measurements. But, you know, all this stuff adds up. So every deer is different. But that's just a little way of being able to tell quickly, just a very general idea of some mass. So let's just take a second and let's think about this deer. And you guys, you can type it in the chat or the Q&A if you want to make some guesses, but just kind of think about what we've talked about You know, a 7-inch ear. This deer is, he's a mainframe 10, looks like he don't have a brow on his right side. He is trying to grow a little G5 on his left that's probably not an inch long, so each time has to be an inch long to get counted. Let's kind of think about what you think this deer would age, what age he is, and then what his score would be. So if you guys have kind of done some studying on it, I'll walk you through what I'm looking at. And then we're going to do this again on the next one with a little more mature deer. So in my mind, this deer is going to be somewhere around 140 inches. He's got really good genetics, really. It looks like, you know, he's got a little sticker off his left G2 there that's going to be 1.5 inches long, so that'll add a little bit. Not much mass, just kind of thin. Again, he's missing a brow on his right side, which is going to cost him about 2.5, 3 inches on an overall score. Looks like that G5 on the left side is not going to be long enough to probably count. Probably going to be around a 5/8 or 3/4 inches, so that wouldn't count. About 16 inches of inside spread is what I've got him figured at. All in all, the deer is really good. I think he's probably a 2.5 or 3.5 year old deer. You can see he's still got a small neck. You know, this kind of looks like a early spring type picture right before he shed to me, just kind of the shape the body's in. It's not really that pre-rut, you know, summer type. He's got a winter coat, but he's got more of a summer look as far as his body appeal. And sometimes that's pretty hard to judge deer right around that time. But yeah, I'm going to say 2.5, 3 year old deer, somewhere between 135 and 140. So Mark was really close. Mark, you guessed 2 year old at 125. I think he's a little better than that, but yep, real close to that. So here's another deer. Let's think about this. This is a mature deer. This is a deer I actually picked the shed up of, so got a really good idea of about what he is. Let's think about that head. You know, this is a September picture, so you know, just to show the body size and things, this is a big body deer. He's not even in the rut yet, and he's already, you know, really bulky. So think about all that. Look at that head. Look at the head from the side. Remember what we talked about that head just looking shorter and stockier from all the different angles. So I'll kind of walk you guys as far as score, kind of what I think. You know, he's got really good mass. So on that left side especially, you can see that frontal picture. The left side H1's going to be a little bit bigger than the right side. I'm going to say he's going to be up there 5 1/4 bases. Kind of loses it. His mass don't carry all the way through like a lot of your really high scoring deer, but good time length. You know, just overall a really mature deer. I'm going to figure that I think the deer is probably 5.5 years old. You can see he just carries himself really swayed back. You can see in that bottom left picture how his back starting to sway. And I think it's very important to remember that this is a September picture. You know, this deer in November and December would look like an absolute giant. I mean, he probably wouldn't even hardly have a neck. As far as the score on the deer, I picked up his shed. He was 66 1/8 on one side. So let's just kind of do the math. If you got 66 on one side and you give him an 18-inch spread, assuming, and you can see both of his sides are pretty symmetrical, he's going to be right around 150 to 152. So really, really good. That's a Midwest deer, but really, really good whitetail, and just really a good illustration of age, if nothing else. So any other questions around anything we've covered tonight? Mark asked, where did you get his shed? Actually, I picked it up while I was turkey hunting very close to where this trail camera picture was taken. So deer shed their antlers. They'll start shedding in February, and then so they'll shed their antlers, and they start a new year of antler growth shortly after. But I think they put on about 70% in May and June. What is your highest scoring deer that I've harvested? Is that the question? I've killed 2 really good deer in the 190s. We got a question: does the darkness on the tail play a different with age? Nah, that is kind of neat about this deer. You don't see many with that black spot like that. But I like your eye, because that would be a telltale deal for me to tell this deer year after year, even without his antlers, is when you see something like that. I've seen deer with black socks up their feet, up to their ankles, black marks different places. I've seen little fawn spots that they never get rid of. So that's a good eye to kind of observe that abnormality. We got a question from Danny here. It says, how do you score or measure does in the field? Obviously, score pertains to antlers, and does don't have antlers, but that you can still age them. And the age characteristics of a doe is in a lot of ways similar to bucks as far as the body. The only difference as far as scoring or aging a doe is they're just not going to get rutted up like a buck and get that swollen neck. So you're really judging off the core of their body, and their head or their neck's not going to play as much of a factor. Now their heads do, and kind of going back to that, instead of having what appears to be a shorter head like some of your big mature whitetail or bucks, a lot of times your does will just have a really long head when they get older. That's a good question. All right, if there's no more questions, I'll close this out. So if you guys have enjoyed what we're doing, be sure to sign up for the next virtual classes. You'll be going through, you can find them all listed here, and then you'll go through the Go Outdoors page. If you get on Go Outdoors and you log in and you go to the events tab, you can actually search the Hunting and Fishing Academy tab, and you can sign up for all of them that you're showing interest in. And then also, even if you can't make the class live, you'll still be getting those recordings after. Danny asks, how many bucks versus does for a season? I'm not sure your question on that. You can kill, if you're talking about bag limits, 2 bucks for the season, and you, over here in the West at least, and I think almost the whole state now, you can kill up to 3 does a day. So it's very liberal doe limits. All right, guys, thank you for joining us. If you haven't already, join us on social media at Tennessee Wildlife Federation. Thank you, guys.